the journey to learning Kubernetes started. Didn't even know about Kubestronaut. Don't even know if it was a thing at the time. But yeah, found some of the resources and effectively dabbled from there.
That's very interesting. I started my career likewise, in a support role.
And you've got your lab, right? And that's a really, really good way to kind of capture. The more you learn, the more you realize that you don't know as much as you thought you did.
So for the exam, especially the CKA or one of the hands-on exams, what are your tips during the exam? What should you do? Should you not do? And have you failed in any of the exams anytime? And if so, what did you learn from that? Are there any other additional time management tips or hacks that you can suggest everyone, either within the exam or outside? All right, so that's the quick intro for the session. Now I'd like to bring in our guest for today. Saed Farah, who works as a senior security engineer at Google, is based out of London. He recently became a Kubestronaut. He's got the Kubestronaut jacket, and he's with us today to share his experience of going through. So welcome, Saed. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Mumshad. Thanks a lot for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, Saed. Like, what do you do? Where are you from? And then we can get into this whole Kubestronaut journey and what really motivated you.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, super quick before I do crack on, it's important to keep in mind that all views shared, of course, are my very own, and I'm not representing Google or Alphabet in any official capacity at all. So it's just important we get that out of the way. Quick intro about me. I'm based in London. So I work currently as a senior security engineer at Google, mainly exploring, all sorts of things around Kubernetes security, just trying to really make sure that we effectively find any sort of, anomalies around, architectural components that could potentially lead to exploits or compromises for the organization and its clients. So that's effectively what I do. For me, I'm super interested in Kubernetes, of course, as you can tell from the jacket. As you can tell, obviously, I'm on your platform. Yeah, it really excites me. It's a really, really complex and really, really different tool. It's a tool that's super, super different to any, technology that's previously been used. And yeah, it just really, really excites me. And there's so many things to cover, really. The more you learn, the more you realize that, you don't know as much as you thought you did. So yeah, just super curious.
Awesome. So before we dive in, I'd like to understand a little bit about your background. So can you tell us a little bit about maybe life before Google and what were you doing, and what technologies were you into? What did you study? A little bit about your background.
Absolutely. So yeah, I did an undergrad in business management, which is super different to anything in this sort of space. So already coming from a super unconventional angle, I was kind of in a position where if I wanted to get into tech, I was kind of disadvantaged because a lot of the people I was up against were either A, super experienced in the field, or B, came through the conventional routes that obviously were a lot more favored to employers. So yeah, I guess I had a very interesting friend of mine who actually was super curious about tech, went on a very interesting journey, came back and shared what he'd learned to the group and said, hey, look, there's this thing, tech, it's really, really interesting. And yeah, that sparked my interest, and he introduced me to a few of his teachers. And from there, really, that was where the curiosity kind of stemmed from. So worked through the ranks of IT support initially, and, again, working from hardware through to software. From that point, it was like, okay, so now I'm in tech. Where do we go from here? What's the ladder like? What's progression look like? What does it look like if I wanted to pivot from support into, say, something a bit more, something a bit more stimulating, sort of for the mind, engineering side of things. And that's when, started to dabble around a little bit into the cloud. I'm going to be honest, initially it was AWS. Some of my Google counterparts may look at me with some eyebrows raised, but I did kick off with some AWS. So I went through the route of learning through the AWS and the Microsoft as well. And then from that point, my previous employer before Google was actually, working quite closely on some clusters. And at that point, I was kind of like, okay, clusters, it's interesting. Let's see what that's about. And, found Kubernetes obviously it was this thing, and, there's this community behind it, and it's open sourced, and really started to, and it naturally grew, the curiosity grew further. So I started learning about how open source worked and how, the community worked. And it was just a space that I wasn't previously, exposed to. So yeah, that's effectively pre-Google. And yeah, that's how effectively the journey to learning Kubernetes started. Didn't even know about Kubestronaut. Don't even know if it was a thing at the time. But yeah, found some of the resources and effectively dabbled from there.
Awesome. Yeah. So that's very interesting. I started my career likewise, in a support role as well. So I spent the early days of my career doing technical support for like storage systems for companies, and then like you eventually moved into like a more of an ops role, and then eventually into a developer role, and then into DevOps. So that was kind of my journey. So yeah, it's very interesting. So how many years of experience did you have like before?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yeah, at the time previous to Google, effectively, because Kubernetes is such a, I guess, relatively new tool, it isn't as obviously as new as old as say Microsoft. If a person, if we're looking for an Active Directory expert, then you've got people who have been in the game for 20 to 30 years, right? And that automatically puts you in a bit of a disadvantage, especially if you're starting out. Whereas with Kubernetes, you've got this tool that's only been around for 10 years. The attack vector, particularly if you're looking from a security standpoint, it hasn't really been explored. You can't find a PhD in that space. So it puts people who are starting off in this really good level playing field. So for me, I didn't necessarily need 15 years of experience working with Kubernetes, because that just doesn't exist, right? You can't have 15 years of experience working on a tool that's only been around for 10 years. So for me, before getting at Google, I'd say it's about 6 to 7 years of experience, comprehensive of support and the DevOps and the security. So that's
interesting. Yeah. So tell us about the Kubernetes journey. Like, when did you first hear about Kubernetes, and why did you start learning about it? Did it just come up as part of a job, a project? Sometimes for some users, it just comes in as a requirement, but others are maybe not so fortunate in terms of being able to find an opportunity to work with Kubernetes or any of the training technologies, and you just learn for the sake of learning, for the interest. What was it like for you?
Right, that's a really good question there, Mumshad. So for me, the previous employer before Google, they were a consultancy, and the client at the time was the UK Home Office. And it was super interesting because obviously the Home Office being so broad, so big, they had a number of different projects going on at the same time. And one of the role that I came in at the time was effectively a DevOps engineer, right? But my main focus and what sort of got me over the line was my experience in infrastructure as a code. So it hadn't even been Kubernetes, right? Dabbled with it a little bit, done a few upgrades, but nothing really as intricate as they were expecting me at the time. So thankfully, I was able to get into the position to be able to get myself in front of the client at the time. And then the requirement came. So they came with a number of different targets for the year to say, hey, this is what we want from you. This is the platform you'll be working on. And for me, I work best under pressure. I noticed before I came on, you mentioned about, the advice of actually booking the exam before you're even ready for the exam. And that builds a level of pressure. And that's actually the point I'd probably touch a bit on in a minute. But for me, the client at the time my manager at the time who was representing the client had said, hey, this is the platform you're going to be using, Kubernetes. We've got a number of different clusters and this is how it's going to work. Okay, so that was effectively where the seed was sort of planted in me to explore Kubernetes, and obviously looking around and found the relevant resources. Of course, KodeKloud was paramount in those studies for me at the time. I'd say kicked off around that sort of time, and that's when I pursued CKA as a start. And I think this was before KCNA. So this is even before that. It was just the CKA, CKAD, and CKS at the time. It was the trifecta. Nowadays, it's the Kubestronaut, right? So yeah, that's kicked off by sort of learning the CKA, did all the material that I needed to do at the time, and I managed to clear that exam, and all things were thumbs up and good. The pressure started to build at work really when I realized that, they weren't really kidding around the requirements. And I'd noticed that a few of my colleagues had effectively been released and laid off because they hadn't been able to sort of adapt under those kind of circumstances. So that's when it kind of stemmed even further, added more to that pressure amount. And that's where, kind of thought, hey, how do I take this to the next level? I now understand how Kubernetes works. I now understand how CKA works. How do I take it to the next level? And that's when I decided to, pursue the CKAD and, followed it up with the CKS later on.
Yeah, no, totally agree with you there. I think I do have some of my own personal stories about, being under pressure and just helping me push myself to learning. So during the early days of my career, I was in like professional services, and I would, they would send me to these different clients with different project requirements. And I was with EMC at that time. So we had like a lot of different products, like from like storage arrays to like software products to middleware and everything. And, every project would be like a completely different tool or a new product that I would just have to learn on the go. So they would just send me to a location, and I would go there and then realize that there are these things that I would have to learn before I can even speak to the client. So it would just push me to like, spending the nights and weekends and everything learning to be able to then go in and do the work. So yeah, I totally, aligned with you there on being under pressure. And I think the same is true for the learning cohort here, right? And one of the hacks that I've been using is really to just book the exam in advance. So there's no other option to just do it. Cool. So yeah, I mean, so maybe we can dive into a little bit more about the Kubestronaut journey and how you started. So like, why did you even start with the certification in the first place? Like, and which one did you target first?
Absolutely. So yeah, just touching back on that previous point about the pressures at work and trying to understand how these things work. So the difference with the Kubernetes certifications, as we all know, are that one, it's very practical. So it's no longer multiple choice as it's been with a lot of the other cloud providers. So this was a really interesting way for me to actually get a feel for production without breaking anything or without angering anyone. So I was able to break clusters, totally wreck things and see how all these different components fit in. So for me, with the need of or with the requirement of having to be able to actually operate a production grade cluster, I needed practical experience, and that's what the CKA offered me. So that's the choice behind the CKA, was to administer the Kubernetes cluster. So that's where I started initially, and that was an interesting journey for me. I was able to actually get a decent way through, and once I completed that, I then decided to, again, take it to the next level. When I saw that a few of my peers were being laid off, I said, hey, I need to really make myself regiment in this space. And that's when I went for the CKAD. Thought that would be the next step. Now, a lot of similarities. There's a lot of crossover between the CKA and CKAD. I'm not going to go into too much detail there. Obviously, with the cohorts, I'm sure you'll be able to cover a lot more of that. But for me, it was only logical after that point to go for the CKS. But with the momentum of passing 2 exams in the space of a month, I decided, hey, it may be a good idea to then, take the CKS in the following month. So I reached out and made the proposal to my manager and said, hey, look, this is what I want to do. I've done these 2 exams and I'm really propelling in this space, and I'd like for you guys to, expense this 3rd exam for me. And he kind of quickly turned it down. And this is my previous employer, just to be crystal clear. This isn't at Google. This is a little while ago now. And he turned it down at the time, and he said, hey, look, great job on the CKD, but security isn't really in scope. So I don't think it's the best thing to do. But, as someone who's in the space, you're curious by a platform. You don't really understand a platform unless you really understand how vulnerable a platform is. So I thought security, even though I wasn't at the time working in cyber security, and my focus was mainly to kind of work on the infrastructure, I thought it's still, a massive pillar to understand the entire scope, the entire Kubernetes architecture. Excuse me. So yeah, I got kind of hushed out of that for a little while and had to kind of bite the bullet, because these exams, they weren't exactly cheap, right? The exams aren't cheap. That's obviously everybody knows that. So thought, let's hold off for a little while. gave it a few weeks or months, and I moved on to a different project with a new allocated manager. Made the case again. Thankfully, it was a lot more supportive and supported that case, and I was able to get the CKS. So I left it at that, and then obviously with what I've gained from experience, I was able to get involved in a lot more research pieces and did a lot outside of work. I was able to document a lot of this on my Substack newsletter, Medium articles, making YouTube videos, and it made a massive case for me to be able to put myself forward to apply to the very company that Google was actually born. As we know, right, Google is a variation or a later version of Borg, obviously open sourced and the likes. So I was able to land the role, and then after, when I got in, I thought, hey, how do I now take it to the next level? And that's when this new paradigm of Kubestronaut came around, and started to kind of see what was going on in that space. And at that time, I only had the two multiple choice exams left, KCNA and KCSA. So it was a nice way to kind of round it all off with the theory, to just kind of validate what I had already kind of experienced and worked with in the cluster. So there wasn't too much prep that needed to go into those two exams, but it was a really, really nice touch in the end of it.
Awesome. So you did the CKA first, and then I guess you said in a month CKAD. Is that right? Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. CKAD followed, I think, 2 weeks after, and then had some, I'd say, internal issues with taking the CKS because of work things.
Yeah. So the security side of things. So that's, I guess, now is key for you. Like, have you always been in security? Like, before this role, were you also involved in the security field?
No. I did have a few security incidents at work, and I worked quite closely with the security folks. But I'd say security wasn't something that, again, I didn't go through that conventional, cyber security route or the software engineering route or the DevOps route. It was more of a case of learning on the job, in the experience, getting more curious, understanding things, and research that led to the points that I'd say allowed me to kind of progress through my career. So I'd say the CKS along with a lot of the research that I did on the side was something that was, again, paramount to getting into Google as a senior security platform engineer. But the platform engineering side is more where my experience and expertise was at the time.
Yeah. So you got the CKS certified and then moved into Google, or? Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly that. So CKS came through. That was a good way to validate and actually have something tangible to show for my experiences, and just to validate to the the guys who was talking to that this is something that I'm not playing around with. Because again, there's that stigma around the CKS being the most difficult of the Kubernetes chain, because there's a lot of different open source tools that you need to also understand. And during the exam as well, you need to also, be able to filter through some of their documentation as well, like the Falco, for example, is, right, you need to look at their documentation, and Trivia's got their own documentation, and there's a number of different tools. So you explore a lot of different tools that are very, very, I'd say significant in this space for sure.
Awesome. So as a platform security engineer, is that what you said your role is? Yeah. How does that look like? Like, what's your day-to-day look like, and what are the kind of the security related, topics that you've learned, you had to learn as part of the job? How did the stuff that you learned for CKS, how did that apply to your job?
Yeah. So if we're talking more generally about Kubernetes anyway, right? A lot of the tools that we're talking about are open source. So if you think about, say, Falco, for example, Trivia, another example, KubeSec, KubeHunter, these are tools that, are in the public domain, in the public space, and a lot of organizations are using that. It's interesting because, obviously Trivia is used for, static code analysis. It helps with, obviously, scanning through you can have a look at KubeBench as another example, KubeScan to check your YAML files. You can take a look at, IDS-ish kind of technologies like Falco or AppArmor if you wanted to block the syscalls as another example as well. Sorry, if you wanted to monitor your syscalls being made with, within your actual cluster. So these are all different tools that are covered in the CKS exam. And these are, again, tools that are covered in the real world as well. So you'll find that a lot of organizations that are running Kubernetes clusters, they will be using these centric tools, right? They'll be using these centric tools. Now, there are tools, obviously, that are proprietary to certain organizations. They create their own custom tools, their own their own property, and that's obviously something that isn't something that we can obviously talk about. That's to decide. But if we talk more generally about the open source tools, and these are tools that are very much well in demand today, and that's what makes Kubernetes different to a lot of these other technologies. Whereas, say in I'm not gonna drag anyone under the bus or any other technology under the bus, but if you look at some of their material, some of them are outdated a little bit. Whereas what I found is in the Kubernetes space, because it's moving so fast, and again their curriculums, they also need to be updated as fast to keep up with the demand. So yeah, that's how I'd effectively say that.
Yeah, totally. We know like all about it. Like we update our labs every quarter because the Kubernetes exam gets updated to the latest version every quarter. So just to keep up with that, we are like updating hundreds of lab scenarios and testing it to make sure the lab environments, the labs work with the environments, underlying environments. So yeah, we kind of have been chasing Kubernetes ourselves in kind of trying to keep up with the changes and with the content. Cool. So, and how can you tell us a little bit about how long did it take for you to prepare for the CKS exam after you did CKAD?
Absolutely. So yeah, so the CK that was roughly around, I'd say, 3 weeks to a month, and I like to do this thing where I like to kind of break down things into smaller goals. And what I found in the study material for obviously the CKAs and the CKA and the CKAD, it's all following a really good curriculum where you've got your theory effectively explained to you in animated format. Directly below that, to follow up and validate that, then you've got your lab, right? And that's a really, really good way to kind of capture the knowledge. And so per section, if we're talking, let's say an hour on an average, then I know that, okay, I would like to do a section a day. And if we've got about 30 sections or so, then I know that within 30 days, I'll be able to complete it. Now, some days it will be less than an hour, which means I could do maybe 2 sections in a day. But at least that way I've got a tangible workflow. And I like to see things as I do it. So I keep a notepad. This is general advice for anyone else who would like to follow a similar sort of structure. You'd have your notepad or your whiteboard, however you'd like to keep track of it. And you could just tick each of those sections off as you complete them. And if you like, you can even be more pedantic, and per section you maybe want to capture each clip. So that way you could even be even more specific, which is super interesting. So that's the CKA. CKAD is slightly different because with the CKS, it's slightly more different because you've got a number of different tools that you're learning. So maybe I'd track it on the basis of those tools. Okay. So that way I could say, okay, today I'm going to do Falco, and Falco is something that I'm going to explore. And there are a number of different resources that you can kind of use. So the CK, I'd say, because it was kind of more, I'd say, generic, you're getting good understanding of how the architecture works more generally, versus the CKS, it kind of assumes that you already understand the basics of Kubernetes. I think CKA, it is a prerequisite for the CKS anyway. So by the time you sit the CKS, you'd already kind of be in a bit of a flow with how to navigate those imperative commands, which are imperative to do the CKS.
Awesome. So that's great points, right? Like I would love to double click on some of those things you mentioned there, like the way that you learn, right? How the way you prepare. So you mentioned one section a day, maybe an hour worth of study a day. So let's start with that. How does your day look like usually? So you have the 9 to 5 job, and then how do you structure your studies for the rest of the day? Do you study in the evenings, and what about weekends? And how do you kind of manage work-life balance?
It's a really good question. I get asked that question quite a bit actually, so it'd be good to consolidate this, maybe clip it and just send it to those who ask again. So the way I tackle it, particularly having a family as well on top of that, is kind of even more challenging. I tend to do a lot of my exam preps in the mornings. I find the mornings are the best times for me. And in the mornings, everything's kind of stopped. Everybody's resting, everybody's sleeping, nobody's going to call your phone, nobody's going to bother you. And generally at those kind of hours, they're unsocial anyway. So nobody's really going to be, pinging you about anything. So those are the hours that I find most beneficial for myself. And I find that in those mornings, I'm able to be most active, most awake, most alert. Me and my coffee in the morning on my desk, and that's probably the best time as for time, and that's the time that I tend to revise. And I believe all my exams have been sat in those hours anyway, between, I'd say, maybe 5:30 to roughly around 8 o'clock before the working day. And that also comes with demand, obviously subject to or relative to, demand at work. Of course, some days it could be weekends, other days it may be weekdays. So yeah, generally I'd say the best times for me is certainly the mornings. And if I want to recap on a more casual basis, then I might go to the coffee shop in the evenings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how many hours? So, like, how many hours a day? Would it be just an hour a day, or?
So for me, it's like an hour is a good session, but like for me, it's more about comprehension. If I feel like I've comprehended what I actually had set out for the night before, then I could say, hey, that's sufficient for me. I'm okay to return to this later on, rather than doing 6 hours and then leaving it for two weeks or 3 weeks. The approach is more like just incremental additions to the knowledge. You add a little bit each time, and effectively you kind of get to a point where you've compounded all of this knowledge. And in the end, you just feel super strong, and effectively it's just practice at that point. After that, just practice. Yeah.
Totally.
And it also helped that I was working on the platform at the time. That also helps. So I don't want to missell anyone and say, hey, half an hour a day and you'll be a pro. Although that's more than possible. It helped that during the day I was actually able to get on a cluster, and rather than making changes, I was able to actually look at things like the resource quotas for pods in the moment. But you could do the same thing without working. Like you can actually go in the labs again, and it's effectively the same thing. You may not have, all of the different extra tools, but it may help you for simplicity purposes to be able to just look at the labs and take it from there and during the day, just so you keep the muscle memory going, I'd say.
Yeah. No, great points there. So I think it's different for different people. Like for me, I'm a night owl, so I like to stay up late night, and I think my most probably productive hours are like 12 to maybe 3 a.m. or something, and I sleep through the mornings usually. So I think whatever works for you, right? Like if you can find time that's like peaceful for you, and I think for a lot of people it's early morning. That's what I've heard. Like as soon as you wake up and you freshen up and you have your coffee, that's when you feel like the most energetic. And your point about like a few hours a day, I think that also makes a lot of sense, because a lot of times just spending a lot of hours in a single day might just exhaust you and overwhelm you. And sometimes you feel like you're learning something and you're just not really understanding it. And if you actually take a break and come back to it the next day, you probably understand it better. Sometimes you notice that. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because although the mornings are for me the best times to pick up on new things, like new concepts, but at times I'll go to bed and just think about that, the one bug or that one log entry, and think, oh, you know what, that's bugging me. So you head over to the desk and find yourself 3 a.m. and you're just hacking through the cluster. So it is relative, of course, on days and that sort of thing. So
no. So a couple of things you mentioned, a few hours or maybe an hour every day consistently. So consistency definitely does matter. Do you find yourself like, did you actually put in time on the weekends or something, especially like if you're nearing an exam?
Yeah, absolutely. So like when you come up to like the point in which it's the weekend before the exam, it's like it's kind of manic a little bit, especially like early on when I wasn't as confident on the command line as I would have been now, right? So at the time it was like any chance you get, hey, this is what I'm going to do. I'll be here for these hours, and I'd often take a short break and, like you said, come back, maybe go for a walk if something's just not making sense. Go for a walk. I did have troubles trying to understand the difference between VMs and containers when I first started. So again, like Kubernetes for the absolute beginner was very, very important before even getting into the CKs. I didn't just dive straight in there. There were some prerequisite courses I needed to understand container runtime versus Hyper-Vs and try and make sense of all that good stuff. So yeah, a lot of it is like sort of structured knowledge, and like I think to just have a plan is always good, whether you do it in the evenings, if you do it in the mornings, whatever works best for you. So everything is relative, I guess, but yeah, just as long as you hold yourself to account and you've got someone to keep you to account, that's just always important.
Got it. Yeah. So apart from the timing, then you said one of the things you do is you keep track of your learning in a notepad or whiteboard or something, and then you keep checking it out. Do you find yourself like going through the course again, like kind of revising the entire course and going through all the labs and stuff like that? Like how many iterations of the course do you usually take?
Yeah, really good point. I think everybody has different strengths, but again, everyone's got different strengths. So maybe networking might be your thing, or maybe security might be your thing. So you have a section that you'll enjoy more, and if it isn't your strength, then maybe you just enjoy it more, right? So there may be areas that hey, I'd really like to know more about that. So you read or you watch the video, and then you go and do your lab. You're still kind of curious about it. So then there's extra links, which is always good, right? There's always a slide with extra links. You can go and start reading a bit more about it. So for me, it's like if something just doesn't click for me, maybe in that moment it just won't click. Yeah. So maybe I'll just move on to the next section and then return back to it, as I found is a good approach even within the exams. Because the worst thing you could do is sit there and just really think and beat yourself up mentally. Because that can also be quite toxic as well for you, especially under high pressured environments like an exam or like preparing for an exam that's nearing the deadline. Yeah. So yeah, I'd say like I'd have like a good run, maybe the one run, and then just mark off the areas that I thought, hey, that area isn't great, but what is it about that area that isn't so great? And then maybe watch a supplement video on it, or read an extra blog about it, a supplement blog, and that will just help comprehend that better.
Yeah. Interesting. So let's talk about the exam itself and how you prepare for that. So just to summarize, so you had the CKA first, and then in a couple of weeks you had the CKAD, and then I guess a couple of months for the CKS.
Yeah.
Right. And then you join Google, and then after that you do the KCSA and the KCNA to just top it off. That's right. And because you have had all the three before, I guess a lot of foundations were in place, which would have helped you easily crack the KCSA and the KCNA certifications.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for the exam, especially the CKA or one of the hands-on exams, like what are your tips during the exam? What should you do? Should you not do? And have you actually have you failed in any of the exams anytime? And if so, what did you learn from that?
Absolutely. No, it's incredible questions actually, because it's also important to shed light on the entire picture. A lot of people, they look at it and think, oh, this guy's gone and done all 5 exams. How's he gone and done that? It must be really difficult. But so for me, I'd say generally speaking, all of the different sort of exams, they all have a very common theme. I've noticed, and correct me if I'm mistaken, people may have, and it's also relative to your strengths as well. The theme that I've noticed is that the exams always start off with slightly, I'm not going to say easier, but slightly less difficult questions, and then gradually build you up to an absolute a challenge towards the end. So it's important to note that, okay, hey, this is cool, I get it, but also understanding that towards as you kind of progress through the exam, it may get more difficult. So for me, it was like, okay, I've got the first question out the way, great. Second, third, roughly about 16 questions. So maybe when I get to about 12 questions, I start to notice, okay, now I'm kind of slowing down a little bit. I noticed, and I do know that some people start with the more difficult questions and work their way down. My thing is, I like to build confidence through the exam. So I much prefer sitting the first few questions. And if I find something that's a bit challenging, I'm not going to waste half a second trying to work it out, because it's not mathematics where you can kind of, think about, a different way of doing it. Generally speaking, there's one way of, not just one way of doing it, but if you're working with the Kube API server, you don't want to do anything that, isn't necessarily, you're not 100% confident about, because that's a component of the cluster that if it goes down, then you could potentially mess up a number of different questions. And I'll get into that in a moment, right? Because if you have 16 questions and, you have 4 clusters, then it's important to note that if one of the questions requires you to, play with the API server by adding or removing a parameter, that cluster will go down, and every question that depended on that cluster will obviously,
Go down with it.
you'll feel that burden, right? It will go down with it, right? So it's a challenge. So it's about being kind of strategic, and I had to keep that in mind with the first exam, with the CKA and the etcd cluster. It was the etcd, sorry, the etcd database needed a snapshot and upgrade, and I think restoration. I believe it was a little while ago now, but there's that question, and you get. I'm not sure how it's marked exactly, but the snapshot is relatively straightforward. But the restoration of it requires you to kind of tamper with the API server, and that's where, for me, preparing for the exam, I wasn't so confident about. So in the exam, I decided, hey, I'm not going to muck around with that. So I actually left that part out. I managed to pass with a pretty good score. So it's like you kind of need to make those decisions.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the CKA. And for the CKS, it was a lot more difficult. I did kind of mess up with the actual, I think it was the Falco rules, and I wasn't able to get that question in correctly, as well as the TLS. I believe there was another section on TLS as well, which wasn't quite straightforward for me as I'd like it to be. Well, I wasn't as prepared. So that first attempt didn't go as planned, and I actually didn't clear that exam. I had to actually come back to that and obviously humble myself to say, hey, maybe I need to go deeper on this. So yeah, I mean, exams, they don't always go as planned, and it's not the end of the world. It's just about how you pick yourself up after that exam, which is super important.
Very, very valid point. So, like, without getting into the specifics of the exam or any of the questions, right? When you when you had to take another attempt at the CKS, because I think a lot of people face that, because it is really one of the more challenging stuff. And I think we have to work on the course a little bit more in making things a little bit more simpler. Or maybe you can give some feedback. So let's say stuff like stuff that are complicated. Where do you think is the knowledge or kind of the skills or our experience lacking? Because in the CKA, we know it's a lot specifically about Kubernetes, and a lot of the things are basic stuff like creating a pod and deployments and stuff like that. It's probably the most foundational certification for Kubernetes. But when it gets to the security side of things, is it Kubernetes related knowledge that's lacking, or is it more security related knowledge, or the stuff that are outside of Kubernetes that lacking? Again, without really getting into any specifics on.
Yeah, of course. So the CKS is a super interesting one, because it's the one exam that actually requires you to go super deep in everything, assuming you have the Kubernetes knowledge, everything but Kubernetes. So like all of the different open source tools and all that good stuff. I think there should be more emphasis on how to actually navigate the documentation. That is super important. So I found that with all the different exams, they're all open book, right? So you're able to actually access the documentation. So maybe I'd say like slightly more emphasis on that, because if a person can navigate the documentation well enough, then they've saved themselves a lot of time. Because a lot of the time it isn't you, if you're told to create a pod, whether it's using an imperative command or whether you decide to use a declarative command, it doesn't matter. The point is there's a way to create it, and a lot of the time the actual solution or parts of the solution will be in the documentation. So if there was emphasis on, hey, navigate through it using this mechanism or this way, and I know that may not be in scope for the actual exam criteria, but I think that if that habit is picked up early on, then it will save people a lot of trouble and a lot of time. So I wouldn't say it's an issue with the actual content. The content is great. It's more of a case of like, those exam tips and tricks that won't necessarily be incriminating, right? They're not incriminating. This is just general information.
And what do you think about like these additional topics, right? Let's say Falco or an external tool, right? Trivi or something that needs to be learned. Have you found yourself like going in and spending time learning that tool just by yourself? From the source, like let's say documentation of that tool, maybe like spending a few days just on that, just really understanding why the tool exists, and trying it out yourself and stuff like that. Do you do that often?
Yeah, so it's really important for me anyway. As I mentioned previously, I'm more of a practical learner. I like to see how things work in practice. So I would like to, the cogs move, and how does this communicate with that? How does it wire up to that? How does Falco pick up on that? It sits in that etc file. So what makes it alert to the actual, the body, and allow you to actually push those alerts out? So yeah, trying that out is super important, and doing it in a number of different capacities as well, and not just focusing on the one curriculum. There are other platforms as well that also are free that you can also use. I believe Killer Shell comes with the actual exam when you book the exam, right? So putting it into practice there is really important. And then from that point, once you finish the actual exam, you're able to see what their solutions would have been. So that I found was super important as well, because there's a way in which I was creating a pod, and I've seen another more efficient way of doing it with the actual solution of Killer Shell. And Killer Shell obviously being endorsed by CNCF, it's obviously clearly legitimate, right? So yeah, super helpful that.
Got it. Okay, cool. So outside of everything we've spoken about, are there any other additional time management tips or hacks that you can suggest everyone, either within the exam or outside?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess, yeah, this is, again, we probably all heard it before, but I'd probably emphasize on not reinventing the wheel. So if you're told to create something, don't try and write out a manifest file yourself. It sounds super silly, but like it will save you a lot of time. And this is the one space that copying and pasting is actually promoted. Like you often hear a lot in academics, hey, don't copy and paste, don't copy someone else's work. Here is the space that, it's all about efficiency, particularly if you're thinking about the exam. Maybe less so in the production area, right? You might want to be a lot more, meticulous about things to have security in mind first. Of course, you want to think, and things may take a bit more time, but for the exam, you want to be as efficient as possible. So I'd say take your manifest files templates from the Kubernetes documentation and then edit them from there. Also, validating your work is also important as well. Once you finish a section, you can also go through and validate it. If you're told to create a resource, check that resource out. Describe the resource. If it's to do with RBAC, then use the relative commands to check if those RBAC permissions have been set. If it's a PVC, then check if they're bound from describing those resources. So things like that, I'd say, really, definitely validate your work. Definitely check for time and that sort of thing. So these are general advice, we've all heard before, but just more emphasis on that, I'd say, from me.
Makes sense. Awesome. All right. So we're about 3 minutes away from the end of today's show. There are a couple of questions, and I'll just bring some of them up. I think there's one question for you, Saed. You should be able to see it on the screen. So can you please tell us what you would say are the requirements beginners must be aware of to operate production in terms of security?
Yeah, this is, again, information in the public domain, nothing gospel here, but principal and least privileges. There are a number of different frameworks that one can follow, one could look at. I'd certainly say if you're looking to think about security, obviously there are a number of different objects or a number of different components within Kubernetes that a lot of people automatically assume are secure by design, but actually aren't. So when you think secrets as another example, you assume that, hey, this is a secret, no one else can access it. Generally, it's not actually the case, and you need to obviously think about things like that. But there are a number of different publications as well, people who have put a lot out there. So I think, on a very high level, obviously conscious of time, I'd say, these are some of the more low-hanging fruits that you need to think about, rather than the more advanced threat detection and intelligence. A lot of the times, it's the low-hanging fruits that catch us out.
Yeah, true. And I guess maybe when you first moved into a more of a security role, were there some kind of beginner level security related topics that you had to say refresh? I know a lot of things must have come through by preparing for the CKS or similar certifications, right? But let's say for your work specifically, did you find yourself having to brush up on any kind of? You mentioned that you did not go through the traditional cybersecurity route, but were there things, were the concepts in those areas that you had to you felt like you had to brush up on?
Yeah, absolutely. And the good thing about a lot of the way things worked out is that the KCSA came after, and it was actually the last certificate I did. So I think it came at a perfect time to just refresh on all of what I'd done in the CKS anyway. So a lot of the toolings, a lot of the best practices and all that kind of good stuff. So it's a really good way to get that, basically kind of, round it all off quite well and put a ribbon at the top of it. So yeah, that was a nice way of doing that for sure.
Cool. So a couple of other questions, I guess, regarding the courses. So when will our cohort path for CKA be updated with these changes? So the changes for the exams are already in, and we're going to be updating the remaining in the upcoming weeks. So hopefully by next week we should have all the changes in. But I would say about 70% of the changes are already there. Will the mocks be also updated? Yes. All the exams and all of our content will be updated to match the new certification changes. Let's try to see. So regarding code for certification purchases, yeah, I think there's a code that we have, but there was a sale that was happening a few weeks back, which is no longer active. But if you follow us, we'll let you know whenever Linux Foundation runs a sale on their exam vouchers. All right, I think we are here. I don't see any other important questions. So, well, thank you so much, Saed, for your time, and thank you everyone for being with us today. Continue to work on the courses, get certified, be inspired by people like Saed, and of course, in the upcoming sessions, we will have more guests coming in sharing their experiences. So, thank you so much, Saed, once again for being with us.
Thank you, Mumshad. All the best, guys.
All right, all the best, everyone. Bye-bye for now.